So I know that this is a very, very late video to be talking about Christmas, and wow, that fire is loud. But anyways, welcome back, heathens. I am Castle, aka The Real Slim Yeezus, and I want to talk to you guys about Christmas and where it came from. Now, many of you may have heard of Yule, or Yule. I'm terrible at rolling my R's, but you get what I'm meaning. But it's a midwinter celebration. Now, I know you all have many questions. Where did it come from? Who were the first people to celebrate it? Is Santa Claus a Gemini? These are very important questions, and we are going to get to all of them. First, let's get the simple stuff out of the way. Where did it get its name? Yule. Now, it's spelled differently in just about every country, but most countries say it or pronounce it the same way, and it is some variation of Yule, Yule, and the Old Norse pronunciation is Yular. And again, I'm terrible at rolling my R's, but Yular is basically, that's how it's supposed to sound, kind of. Now, there's a lot of debate as to where the name came from, and depending on which school of thought you're in, it's gonna really, again, it's gonna depend. However, it's generally believed that that season, the winter season, is also referred to as Hjular in Old Norse and Gaelic calendars, so generally it's believed that that's where the holiday got its name. The winter solstice begins with the celebration Hjular on December 21st. Yeah, we weren't big on naming things back then. It was more of a prepare for the winter and try not to freeze to death kind of feel, more than a Neiman Marcus decorate the house sort of feel. Alright, so let's really bite into the meat of where this holiday comes from and what other holidays are sourced from it and all of the fancy things around this time. So obviously you've got Christmas. Christmas is December 25th. And then you've got Yule, you've got the Winter's Feast, you've got the Wild Hunt, and you've got Alban Arthen. Now, Yule has been widely celebrated by Europeans and Scandinavians all throughout Europe and Scandinavia since about the 4th century. However, most of the modern stuff that is celebrated for Yule, even in pagan respects, is actually heavily influenced by Catholicism and Christianity. So it's not necessarily the same as it was back then. There are some things that have carried over. Thanks, George. Fucking dick. There are some things that have carried over from the old world practices, but not as much as you might think. And we'll talk a little bit more about like how you can celebrate near the end of the video, so stick around for that. Now, you also have the Wild Hunt. Now, the Wild Hunt is fucking crazy, and it deserves its own video. So if you want that, let me know either in the comments down below or by leaving a like if you want a Wild Hunt video, because the Wild Hunt is crazy. It's one of my favorite aspects of pagan mythology, and it's really, really good. But essentially how it goes is a bunch of dead soldiers, a bunch of dead warriors, rather, and any god that you could consider to have a battle connotation to them rides out on the Wild Hunt, and they ride out on the 21st of December, or what would now be the 21st of December, and the Wild Hunt lasts for 3 days. And all of the meat and the pelts that are collected in that time, all of the animal bits, are then given to honorable families or individuals who require them. And this is part of where the gift-giving aspect of Christmas comes in, vaguely. And we'll get to that more in a little bit, because that's also a part of the Winter's Feast. And while the Wild Hunt is primarily Norse, Swedish, Icelandic, it does have there is a similar legend in both Scottish and Irish, Gaelic, Celtic lore. Now, another holiday that happens around this time is Alban Arthen, or Alban Arthur, or as my family refers to it, Alban Anger. Now, this is an Arthurian celebration, more or less, but it's an adaptation of an old pagan legend. So Alban Arthur refers to the light of Arthur, or the white light, and it is a stolen bastardization of Alban Anger, or the light of Angus, and Angus being one of the father gods of Gaelic mythology. Now, Alban Anger has roots that go back all the way to 300 BC, and some that are even before that, but the earliest known practice of it goes back to about 300 BC, and you'll find that a lot of Christian practices, as well as a lot of pagan practices, Norse practices, find their roots here. Now, I'm not saying that necessarily it's the first one, but it's most definitely the oldest celebration that we have to reference in regards to pagan myth and practice. Alright, so I hear everybody asking, I hear you all screaming in the comments, what did they do? How did they celebrate? And we're gonna get into that right now. So, like with most pagan festivals, pretty much any pagan festival you find, be it Norse, be it Gaelic, be it Swedish, be it Danish, any of the pagan festivals, you're going to find that there's a lot of eating and a lot of burning stuff. I was going to say shit, but I'm trying not to swear, so you got slight detour into something. I'm trying not to swear because I want you guys to be able to watch these videos with your families and your kids, but at the same time, if I don't swear, I risk some of these videos being targeted by YouTube or by Kappa for being targeted at children. I don't know how, but educational shit is always marked as being targeted at children. So I'm leaving a lot of my swears in, but I'm trying to keep them mild so you guys can still watch this stuff with your families. I apologize. I know I wanted to keep YouTube a little bit more family friendly and a lot less sweary, but even censoring them I risk getting targeted, so I apologize. Back to the video. With all of these festivals in post-Catholic influence, we see that there's a lot of sacrifice that goes on. It's all about, we must take the sacrifice to the altar, we must take the sacrifice to the temple. This did not exist necessarily pre-Catholicism. There were sacrifices, but it didn't have the same connotation. It wasn't like, oh, we must do this for the gods, or the gods will not bless us. No, it wasn't that sort of direness. It was more of done out of respect and necessity than it was done out of anything else. And I'm going to get into that a little bit more near the end when we talk about the wild feast, the winter's feast and the wild hunt. Okay, so there were usually animals that were killed. They were drained of their blood. The meat was then prepared by priests and magistrates, and then the pelts of the creatures were then lied out to cure. And how they cured was going to dictate how well the following year would go, how well and this had a lot to do with like whether or not the animals were diseased or whether they were healthy, and that would kind of give a dictation as to how well the following year was going to go. Now, while the fancy pagans may call this a sacrifice, this was done much more out of practicality and necessity than anything else, and out of respect for the creatures that gave their bodies for sustenance. You see that a lot more in like Native American practices in more modern aspects, because those civilizations were allowed to keep those aspects for longer, because you think Celtic pagans, Norse pagans, they started losing it to the Catholics and the Christians in the fucking 9th century. So there wasn't as much time to keep these things, and they were lost over time. But that's how it was. For instance, the Tane feast was, or the Feast of Holly, was essentially there would be a central piece, which was usually a hog, and it was primarily a hog in like Norse practice, and then in like Gaelic practice it was typically a lamb, and then the rest of the cattle, whatever cattle was left in the field, would be slaughtered, and then the meats would be smoked and cured, the pelts would be lied out, and then the blood would be blessed and burned. Now, while a lot of times this is perceived as being like a sacrifice in order to appease the gods, it was more or less a sacrifice to the year. It was some of the pieces of the animals were left out as sacrifices to like Cernunnos, and some were left out as feasts to the warrior gods. But more than anything, this was done so that they wouldn't have to feed the animals throughout the winter months. So yes, there was parts of it that were sacrificed for respect, but it wasn't a thing like, oh, we have to do this or the gods will damn us. And the meats would be smoked and cured for the rest of the winter months. Depending on where you were looking, some areas smoked, some areas cured with salt. And that's what the whole start of the winter's feast was. So the wild hunt is essentially the primary warrior and hunter gods taking a bunch of dead lads with them out to hunt for 3 days in the forests. And this hunt would then end with them riding back with their kills, and it was elk, it was deer, boars. Just essentially think of it as a big family affair. To go out and do this, because if I had to go into like all of the gods and the aspects of it, this would be a 5-hour long video, and I know you guys aren't going to sit through that. So just your Odins and your Colcullins, you've got your Thors and your Angus O's, you've got your Baldurs and your Cernunnos. Though Cernunnos was typically seen as riding on a sleigh in the procession of the winter's feast, rarely is he ever depicted as actually participating in the wild hunt. And there are lots of legends like post-Catholicism that if you saw the wild hunt, your soul would get stolen, which was, again, this was Catholic propaganda to try and get pagan celebrations to seem more demonic. There's not a whole lot of that sort of fear pre-Catholicism. I mean, there's a little bit here and there in superstition, but those sorts of superstitions were heavily influenced by the church. And I am more than willing to do a whole video on the Wild Hunt, but it's going to take some major convincing if you guys want me to do this. So, get convincing down below in the zipper section, the towel area, the crotchal portion of the video. So, the Christmas tree. Where the hell did the Christmas tree come from? And what is the deal with Christmas? Why do we celebrate it on the 25th? Okay, so Christmas itself, the Christian celebration of the birth of Jesus Christ was actually celebrated in early spring. Typically around like late February, early March, which is when they believe that he was born in Bethlehem, and because that's around the time that censuses take place, and yes, it was still kind of cold, but at the same time, pregnant women really wouldn't been able to give birth in a stable and the baby survive, even if it was a god baby. So there's a whole lot of conjecture that goes on about that. But when they started recruiting pagans to be in the church in the 3rd and 4th centuries, they started adapting their holidays and their festivals in order to bring them in, and basically making it seem like these were always Christian celebrations and that their gods were trickster gods or demons, and that it was better to pay more attention to the Christian God, to Yahweh, than it was to follow their own gods. So they adapted a lot of pagan festivals and dates. So it likely has to do with Yule starts on the 21st of December, and the vigils, or the Wild Hunt, go until the 23rd. So it stands to reason that Christmas Eve and Christmas, being on the 24th, essentially being like catching all the pagan chads as they're coming out of their party and getting them to come into your party. You know, pagan Christmas is ending. All right, hey guys, we got another party over here. Why don't you come on in and share a drink, huh? At least that's mine and my family's perspective. I don't know if there's a whole lot of evidence for that, but that seems to be how the decision was made. Okay, now the Christmas tree. The Christmas tree is a weird bastardization of an old, like, Gaelic Norse practice of taking fir branches and using them to adorn the outside of the house as a way of, like, becoming one with the forest during the time of Yule. And this was partly a practice of paying homage to Cernunnos, but also is sort of an homage to the green man, the big green guy upstairs. It was saying, like, we are one with nature, we are one with the forest. Our home is in the trees, obviously, because most homes were made of wood, so it was sort of the streamline of consciousness that this would be a part of. And then at some point in the 4th century, the French and English started taking big old trees and putting them in their house. And I actually don't remember what the first instance of a Christmas tree being brought inside was, but it was sometime in the 4th, 5th century, sometime in there, and it was done in England, and it was a gift of housewarming. I know that. But yeah, the English and the French were the first ones to really bring the trees inside and start decorating them. But I know that the first one that was ever done, allegedly, was done as a gift to warm the home during the holiday season. But really, there's a couple of hundred stories as to why that happened, so feel free to pick your favourite one to a degree. Like, my uncle still decorates the outside of his pub with branches, but it's not really commonly done anymore, and actually I don't even think people understand why he does it. But yeah, if you live anywhere in Sweden or Norway and you're in the audience, please let me know down below if anybody you know follows these practices. It'd be cool. So how can we celebrate today? How can you go and celebrate in the old-fashioned ways? Well, we celebrate the old school festival Alban Anger, or Alban Arthan, or Alban Arthur, depending on who you're talking to, where you're talking to, and so on. Which consists of hunting, winter's games, carving, feasting. There are always giant brazier bonfires, and those are usually kept burning all throughout Yule. We've got holly and mistletoe cutting, which there is the holly feast that is at the beginning of Yule, at the beginning of Alban Anger, and then there is the mistletoe feast that happens at the end. And the holly and mistletoe cutting happen during the winter's games, or what would have been the Wild Hunt and the Winter's Feast. We now have Winter's Games. And there are two feasts. The first feast is, of course, the Winter's Feast. That is the one where we celebrate the Wild Hunt, and there is usually an exchange of gifts, but I'm going to talk about that in a second. And the second feast prepares for Imbolc. Speaking of which, shameless future plug, I've got an Imbolc video in the pipeline. I'm planning on having it out either on Imbolc or the day before. So look forward to that. Also, don't hold me to it, but I'm planning on it. I'm trying to get these out consistently for you guys. I'm trying to work out a good schedule. I promise I'm going to start putting out more videos, and they're going to be more consistent. I'm working on it. So one of the big things that is sort of a bastardization that goes on today is where gift giving comes from, and that's a tradition that started in Alban Anger and fortunately carried over to Yule, but then was sort of bastardized as Christian. As not Christian, but as culture sort of moved more towards commercialization of Christmas, it became like, oh, we're just supposed to get each other lavish presents. At the start of the Winter's Feast, people would come to the priests and they would come to the magistrates, and they would say things that they needed to survive winter, be it pelts, be it food, be it clean water, whatever it was. And then this list more or less was put on display, or it was of free access to all of the clans and all of the families who were in association with each other in that particular group. And then after the Wild Hunt was over, these items would be left anonymously for the people who need them, either on, depending on where you're looking at. Again, it varied per region, but it would either be left on their doorsteps, or it would be left in a general hall. There are usually mead halls or gathering halls in most pagan towns where people would go and meet and have revelries, and where like war discussions and things would happen. So there was always a place where these things could be found, and it was almost always done anonymously pre-Catholicism. The best way to celebrate with your family is start a fire. You know, honor your ancestors by telling stories. That's a big thing about Yule and Lunessa and Imbolc, is they are all storytelling festivals. The idea is to remember and honor the ancestors. Tell old stories, tell stories about your family, tell stories about your friends, tell jokes, laugh together, cry together. The whole point is to keep the spirit and the songs of your ancestors alive. So sing, dance, like these. I know it sounds very simple to say, but this is what our ancestors did. They stood around and they told stories, they played music, they danced, they reveled, they feasted, and that was how they celebrated. It wasn't overly complex. It was actually very simple and very divine. One of the big questions I get a lot is, how do you worship during Yule? And the short answer is you don't. Yule is not a festival designed for worship. It is a festival designed for the celebration of the ancestors, celebration of family, the celebration of survival. Now, there are old stories about the winter solstice. It's the shortest day, or is it I think it's the shortest day and the longest night, something like that. I always get it mixed up in my head. But it's essentially the day that the sun dies and it is reborn anew to give us an entire year worth of sunshine after that. And it is supposed to celebrate new life in us. We make it through the year, we make it through the winter, and then at the end of it all, the sun dies, we die, everything dies, and then it is born again in the spring. It is born again in Imbolc. And that is... that's the point. That's what you're supposed to do during Yule. You're supposed to celebrate the survival and prepare for the new. So here's a really cool one. This is what I was talking about earlier when I was talking about how they sacrifice all of the cattle at the end of the Wild Hunt. And they sacrifice what's left of the cattle. Obviously, they would keep around steers and milk cows, but whatever was meant to be consumed is slaughtered at the end of the year. But in Norway and in many parts of Ireland and Scotland, they had the Jularhogger, and that was the Yule hog. And this is why we eat Christmas ham, because it was always the traditional food of Yule and Alban Anger. It was a ham prepared with the cloves and honey. That's why we cook it that way. That is a tradition that has survived for literally almost 3,000 years, and most people don't even fucking know. It's one of my favorite fucking things, because nobody understands, nobody knows, nobody cares why we eat ham at Christmas, but we eat turkey and birds for every other festival. Why do we eat ham? And it's because that's what we've always eaten. It would usually be a wild hog, and it was something that was normally killed during the Wild Hunt, the Winter's Feast hunt. You would go out and you would hunt a hog, and that hog would be the feast for the family or the feast for the clan, however it was. And the Yuletide hog is something that has survived for literal centuries, and it's fucking spectacular. As far as traditional gifts go, I talked about this a little bit earlier, and that's really what it was. It was gifts of necessity. This was always an open communication in ancient clans of what other clans needed, and it was provided crossways. Sometimes you had too much furs, not enough meat, or something along that line. So the different groups would then provide their excess as gift to those who did not have enough. And this was seen as being given to honorable families. And obviously if there was a particular family that was taking advantage of the entire clan, then that would be brought into suspect, and that would be considered dishonorable. But there's not a whole lot of report, at least by my grandfather's books, in that happening. People would exchange in respect what they had too much of in order to share what others needed. And it wasn't like, oh, this is owed to people. If you had too much of something, the tradition during Yule was to, in good spirit, provide that to somebody who did not have enough. So it's not all that different from the Christmas spirit now, it's just less commercialized and more practical. So if you really want to celebrate Yule and Alban Anger and Alban Arthur in a way that is true to your ancestors, ask your family what they need and see if you can provide it. And try and get your family into doing that rather than all of this commercial gift giving. Because honestly, this is a lot cooler. And it's kind of neat. Yeah, you're not going to get a fuck ton of iPads and Apple Watches and all of the other shit. But it's a little bit more wholesome, and it's going to bring you back down to earth and back down to your family. And the neat part about the way that the gifts were given is that they were usually wrapped in dried holly skin or dried mistletoe skin. And part of the winter's games was climbing the trees and clipping the holly and the mistletoe. And the gifts given during the winter's feast would be wrapped in this holly and in the mistletoe, and that's where we get the ribbons and bows from that we wrap around the boxes. So hopefully you guys learned something new. This is one of my favorite things to do. I love sharing the stuff that I grew up with you guys. It is so much fucking fun for me. And I love the community that has grown around this stuff. So you guys, thank you so much for watching. Stay bloodthirsty, my friends. And remember, all hail. Get ready for the Invoke video. Follow me on all the things. Hit subscribe if you haven't already. And ring the bell so you know when I upload, because god damn, it is not yet consistent, but I promise I am working on it. I love you guys. I'll see you in the next one.